Time 11:45 p.m. Place, the freezing, slate gray master suite of the Thorne estate. The war was supposed to be over. But as the heavy oak door clicked shut, my new husband, the most ruthless syndicate boss in the city, turned to face me. His eyes were cold, calculating. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a hostage to break. Take it off, Victor ordered. His voice was a low, lethal rumble in the quiet room. He expected me to beg. He expected a sheltered, high society princess to shatter. I didn't argue. My hands didn't shake. I unfastened the high collar of my vintage lace gown. I let the heavy white silk pool at my feet, exposing my bare back to the freezing air. The silence that followed was absolute. Victor didn't gloat. His breathing just stopped. "What is this?" he choked out. The terrifying syndicate boss suddenly sounded like a man stepping off a cliff. He took a hesitant step forward, his dark eyes wide with horrifying shock as he stared at the jagged, ruined map of whip marks and third-degree burns covering my skin. "Clara," his voice broke, a chaotic rage igniting in his eyes. "Who did this to you?" He thought he was stealing my father's pristine, perfect possession. He had no idea I was already ruined. And he had no idea he was about to start a brand new war just to protect me. Ready to hear how a discarded pawn became the queen of the underworld? Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this dark mafia romance. The heavy oak door of the master suite clicked shut. The lock turned. The sound was small, but it echoed in the cavernous room like a gunshot. The war was supposed to be over. The Sterling family had surrendered. But looking at Victor Thorne standing between me and the only exit, I knew my war had just begun. He did not look like a groom. He looked like a man evaluating a hostile acquisition. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that somehow made him look broader, more imposing than the rumors suggested. His dark eyes were fixed on me. They held no warmth. They held no victory. They only held a terrifying, calculating stillness. I stood in the center of the plush, slate gray rug. I kept my posture perfect. Shoulders back, chin elevated. A Sterling does not slouch. A Sterling does not show fear. That was the rule my father had beaten into me. It was the rule my brother Julian relied on when he sold me to this man. Julian had signed away the family ports, the offshore accounts. And finally, his 32-year-old sister, a living, breathing peace treaty. A hostage wrapped in antique lace. The room was freezing. The air conditioning hummed aggressively. It was a beautiful room, entirely grayscale, overlooking the crashing black waves of the Atlantic. It felt like a museum where nothing was allowed to live. I was suffocating. My wedding dress was a masterpiece of concealment. Long lace sleeves, a high Victorian collar that choked the base of my throat, a heavy, flowing silk skirt that dragged against the floor. The society magazines had called it a bold, modest statement by the untainted Sterling heiress. Victor Thorne just thought I was a prude. He walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy glass. The clink of crystal against crystal was deafening. He did not offer me a drink. He drank it neat, his throat working as he swallowed. He set the glass down. He turned back to me. "You didn't run," Victor said. His voice was a low rumble. It scraped against the quiet walls. "To where?" I asked. My voice was perfectly flat. I had practiced that tone for 2 decades. He loosened his silk tie. He unbuttoned the collar of his dress shirt. The predatory edge in his posture sharpened. Most women in your position would be plotting an escape, or crying in the bathroom. I expected a weeping bride, expected Julian's precious, sheltered princess to shatter. "I am not most women," I said. Victor took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The heat radiating from his large frame hit me before he even touched me. I locked my knees. I refused to step back. I refused to give him the satisfaction of the hunt. "No," Victor agreed softly. "You are a Sterling, arrogant to the bitter end. Your father built a corrupt empire. Your brother traded it for a few more years of breathing. And you stand here, looking at me like I am the dirt on your shoes. He was close now. I could smell bergamot. I could smell the sharp, metallic scent of ozone that always clung to men who carried violence in their blood. I bought you to hurt them, Clara, Victor said. The words were a quiet, lethal weapon. I wanted to take Arthur Sterling's pristine, perfect daughter and drag her into the mud. I wanted Julian to lie awake at night, knowing his sister was locked in a house with a monster. I almost laughed. I truly almost laughed in his face. Pristine, perfect. That was the great illusion. That was the lie my father paid millions to maintain. Julian does not lose sleep over me, I whispered. He sold me because he was relieved to finally throw the trash away. Victor's jaw tightened. A tiny muscle feathered at his temple. He did not like my answer. He did not like that I wasn't screaming. He wanted to break me. He had no idea that my father had already broken me, long before Victor Thorne ever learned my name. Take it off, Victor ordered. The command hung in the freezing air. This was it, the moment of execution. The conquering king claiming his spoils. He wanted to strip away my armor. He wanted to see the pampered heiress tremble in her white silk. I looked at him. I did not argue. Arguing only made the punishment last longer. My fingers moved to the high lace collar at my throat. I started to unfasten the tiny pearl buttons. 1, 2, 3. My hands did not shake. Victor watched me. His expression was impassive. He expected flawless, porcelain skin. He expected the untouched perfection of a girl who had spent her life being protected by bodyguards. He expected to taint something pure. I unbuttoned the cuffs of my long sleeves. I reached around to match my back, finding the hidden zipper. It was stiff. I struggled with it for a moment, my arms aching from the tension of the day. Victor let out a harsh breath. He stepped forward, closing the final inch between us. Turn around. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. The phantom sting of a leather strap flashed across my memory. I pushed the panic down into a tiny, locked box in my mind. I turned my back to him. His warm hands brushed my skin as he found the zipper. I closed my eyes. I braced for the shift in the air. I braced for the disgust. He pulled the zipper down. It made a long, smooth sound, parting the heavy fabric down the center of my spine, all the way to the small of my back. The heavy silk and lace lost its structure. I shrugged my shoulders. I let the top half of the dress fall forward. It pooled around my waist. The freezing air of the room hit my bare back. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. I stood there, staring at the dark window, waiting. Victor did not speak. He did not move. I could hear his breathing. It had suddenly stopped. Then it resumed, shallow and sharp. My back was a map of atrocities. From the base of my neck down to my hips, the skin was a jagged, ruined landscape of old violence. Thick, roped scars from a riding crop crisscrossed my shoulder blades. Paler, smoother patches of skin near my ribs told the story of third-degree burns. On my left shoulder, a raised, ugly starburst marked the place where my father had stubbed out his cigar when I was 16. This was the legacy of Arthur Sterling. This was what he did behind closed doors when a business deal fell through. Julian always hid. I always stepped in the way. And the world called me the pampered princess. What is this? Victor's voice was a harsh, broken whisper. It did not sound like the confident syndicate boss from the altar. It sounded like a man who had just stepped off a cliff into the abyss. I did not turn around. I kept my arms crossed over my chest, holding the front of the dress up. I shivered slightly in the cold. He took a step closer. I felt the heat of his large hand hovering mere inches from my scarred skin. He was refusing to touch me. He was acting as if he was afraid I would shatter into a million pieces. Who did this to you? Victor demanded. His voice was rising. It was thick with a sudden, chaotic emotion, a terrifying rage. I slowly turned around to face him. I let the dress fall entirely. I stepped out of the puddle of white silk. I stood before him in plain white cotton, stripped of the armor I had worn my entire life. Victor stared at me. His dark eyes roamed from my shoulders to the faded bruises on my collarbone. The cruelty that had lived in his eyes all day was entirely gone. It was replaced by a profound, horrifying shock. "You thought my father kept me in a gilded cage," I said quietly. My voice was perfectly steady. "You thought you were stealing his most prized possession. You wanted to ruin me, Victor." I took a deliberate step closer to him. He actually took a half step back. His eyes were locked on the violence carved into my flesh. "Look closely," I whispered. I was already ruined. Victor looked from my scars up to my face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The great, terrifying Victor Thorne looked entirely lost. The pieces were clicking together in his mind. The isolation, the high-necked vintage clothes, Julian's desperate eagerness to hand me over. Arthur did this. Victor stammered. "Arthur, not rival cartels. Not enemies. Your own father." I bent down and picked up a heavy silk robe from the end of the bed. I slid it over my shoulders, tying it loosely at the waist. The soft fabric felt like heaven against my raw skin. I looked at my new husband. "So, if you are planning to beat me, Victor, you are going to have to get in line. And if you are planning to break my spirit to hurt Julian, you are a fool." They gave me to you because I was the only piece of garbage they had left to throw away. I walked over to the massive bed. I pulled back the slate gray covers. I climbed in. I did not look at him again. I reached over and turned off the bedside lamp, plunging my side of the room into darkness. "Good night, Victor." He stood in the center of the room for a very long time. I listened to his breathing. He did not come to the bed. He did not say a word. After 20 minutes, I heard the heavy clink of crystal as he poured himself another drink. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the armchair by the window in the dark, watching the door, guarding the room until the sun came up. Morning arrived without an apology. Pale, gray light filtered through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. It was harsh and unforgiving against my tired eyes. I had not slept much. Every time I drifted off, the phantom weight of my father's cane settled across my shoulders, jerking me awake in a cold sweat. I sat up slowly. I pulled the silk robe tight across my chest. The armchair by the window was empty. Victor was gone. A heavy crystal glass sat on the side table, completely drained. A knock sounded at the door. Two sharp, respectful raps. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs. In the Sterling house, a knock meant Julian was drunk, or my father was angry. It was never a polite request for entry. "Come in," I said. My voice was raspy. The door opened. Victor stepped into the room. He was dressed in dark denim and a black Henley shirt. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like a man who had spent the night walking through a storm. He carried a silver tray. On it sat a carafe of coffee, two ceramic mugs, and a plate of plain toast. He walked over and set the tray down on the edge of the mattress. He did not look at my face right away. His eyes fell to the collar of my robe, checking to see if I was covered, before meeting my gaze. "Black," Victor said, nodding to the carafe. "I didn't know how you take it. Black is fine." I reached for a mug. My hand trembled slightly from the drop in my blood sugar. I steadied it before he could notice. He poured the coffee. He handed it to me, his fingers deliberately avoiding mine. He pulled up a heavy wooden chair from the vanity and sat facing the bed. He leaned his forearms on his knees. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Did Arthur use a knife?" Victor asked. No preamble, no polite morning greetings. I took a slow sip of the coffee. It was bitter and scalding hot. A riding crop, the leather handle, mostly. Sometimes the braided end if he had been drinking gin instead of scotch. Victor's jaw tightened, and the burns. "A kettle," I said softly, looking down at the dark liquid in my mug. I was 19. I told him I didn't want to marry the shipping heir he had picked out for me. "He tortured you over a business merger. He punished me for disobedience," I corrected. In his mind, there was a difference. Sterlings are assets. Assets must perform. Victor stared at me. He was intimately familiar with violence. He oversaw a syndicate that moved weapons and illicit money across 3 state lines. But the violence he knew was transactional, a debt unpaid, a territory encroached. He did not understand the intimate, suffocating cruelty of a father destroying his own child behind locked doors. Where was Julian? Victor's voice dropped an octave. It scraped against the walls of the quiet room, upstairs or out at a club. I set the mug down on the tray. Julian learned early that if he stayed quiet, Arthur wouldn't look at him. I was this shield. Julian didn't cause the bruises. Victor, he just profited from them. Silence stretched between us. It was thick and heavy. I bought you to hurt them, Victor finally admitted. He did not look away. I wanted to take Arthur's pristine daughter and drag her down. You succeeded. No, Victor stood up abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood. No, I didn't. Because they didn't give a damn about you. Julian didn't cry at the meeting because he was losing a sister. He cried because he was relieved. He began to pace the length of the room. His hands were curled into tight fists. They used you to pay off a debt. They handed you over to me, knowing what I am, knowing my reputation. They figured I would just finish the job Arthur started. It is a very efficient business model, I said. Victor stopped pacing. He turned to me. His dark eyes were burning with a sudden, terrifying intensity. Stop doing that. Doing what? Talking like you are reading a grocery list. You are talking about your own torture. Clara, you are allowed to be angry. You are allowed to scream. Screaming never stopped the belt. Victor, I pulled my knees to my chest. It only made it last longer. You learned to detach. You learned to float above it. He walked slowly back to the bed. He stopped mere inches from where I sat. You don't have to float anymore. I looked up at him, studied the hard, violent lines of his face. What does that mean? It means my war with the Sterlings just changed. He reached down. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before resting his large, rough hand gently on the top of my head. He didn't pet my hair. He just let the weight of his palm rest there. It was a grounding force, an anchor. Nobody touches you in this house, Clara, Victor vowed. His voice was an unbreakable iron chain. Nobody, not my men. Not Julian. Not me. I didn't lean into the touch. But I didn't pull away either. I am your wife. A mafia wife has obligations. Your only obligation right now is figuring out how to dismantle your brother without killing him too quickly. Victor pulled his hand back. He turned toward the door. Get dressed. Wear something comfortable. We have a meeting with my lieutenants in an hour. I want you sitting right next to me. He walked out, shutting the door quietly behind him. 2 hours later, I walked down the grand mahogany staircase. The sprawling Thorne estate felt less like a prison and more like a quarantine zone. The house staff treated me with extreme caution. Maids averted their eyes when I walked down the hallways. Word had spread. Not about the scars. Victor kept that entirely to himself. But something in his demeanor had shifted, and his men felt it. I wore a dark emerald silk blouse, high-necked as always, tucked into tailored black trousers. It felt like armor. I found Victor in the formal dining room. It doubled as a boardroom. 12 men in dark suits sat around a massive polished table. The air was thick with tension and the smell of expensive coffee. Victor sat at the head of the table. As I walked into the room, the conversations died instantly. 12 pairs of cold, calculating eyes turned to me. The enemy princess. The hostage. Sit, Victor commanded, gesturing to the empty chair directly to his right. I walked over and sat down. My spine was perfectly straight. A man named Marcus, built like a brick wall with a flattened nose, sneered. He leaned back in his leather chair. Boss, with all due respect, we're discussing the southern port shipments. This isn't exactly a place for a Sterling. The room went dead silent. Victor slowly set his coffee cup down. The ceramic clicked against the saucer. He turned his head to look at Marcus. The look in Victor's eyes was completely devoid of mercy. It was the look of an apex predator. Did I ask for your opinion on my wife's seating arrangements? Marcus, Victor asked quietly. Marcus swallowed hard. His arrogant sneer faltered. No, boss, but she's a Sterling. She's collateral. Victor stood up. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, terrifying grace of violence personified. He walked around the table until he stood directly behind Marcus's chair. Clara is not collateral, Victor said. His voice carried through the massive room, echoing off the high ceilings. She is not a sterling anymore. She is a thorn. She is my wife. And she possesses more intelligence and strategic value than the rest of you combined. Victor leaned down, speaking directly into Marcus's ear. If you look at her wrong, if you speak to her with anything less than absolute respect, I will cut your tongue out of your head. Do you understand me? Marcus turned pale. A sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. I understand. Boss, get out. Victor ordered. You are off the Southern Port detail. Pack your things. Marcus stood up quickly. He didn't argue. He practically ran out of the dining room, the heavy double doors slamming behind him. Victor walked back to the head of the table. He sat down next to me. He adjusted his cuffs, his face a mask of calm authority. He looked around the table at the remaining 11 men. Are there any other concerns regarding Clara's presence? Victor asked. Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed too loudly. Good, Victor said. He slid a thick leather-bound ledger across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of me. Clara, you grew up watching Julian manipulate the family books. Show us where he hides the offshore accounts. I stared at the ledger. Then I looked at Victor. He wasn't testing me. He was handing me a weapon. For the first time in 32 years, I was not a shield. I was the sword. I reached out and opened the book. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing air of the room fill my lungs. The fear that had lived in my chest for decades receded, pushed back by a sudden, exhilarating surge of power. Julian uses a series of shell companies based in the Caymans. I began, my voice ringing clear and steady in the silent room. Let me show you exactly how to burn him to the ground. Julian called on a Tuesday afternoon to check if the merger of our shell companies was complete. He did not ask to speak to me. He did not ask if I was alive, if I was well, or if I had survived my wedding night. I sat in the corner of Victor's sprawling, leather-bound study, listening to my brother's voice through the speakerphone on the mahogany desk. I looked at Victor. He was watching me intently, his dark eyes reading the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of my chest. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. I mouthed the words to him, bleed him dry. The next 3 weeks became a masterclass in financial assassination. The war room of the Thorne estate, a massive, soundproofed chamber adjacent to the formal dining room, became my sanctuary. The massive oak table was constantly buried under mountains of bank statements, shipping manifests, and offshore routing numbers. I worked alongside Victor's top accountants, but it was my mind that held the map. I knew the Sterling Empire's architecture intimately because I had spent my entire life looking for its structural weaknesses, praying for a collapse that I was now engineering myself. Victor and I fell into a strange, intoxicating rhythm. The terrifying syndicate boss I had married began to reveal a completely different facet of his nature behind closed doors. He was meticulous. He was patient. He treated my intellect with a reverence I had never experienced. Whenever I uncovered a hidden account in the Caymans or traced a ghost shipment through the southern ports, he didn't just praise the find. He asked for my strategic opinion on how to exploit it. He asked for my permission before implementing a move that would affect my family's legacy. One evening, deep into our second week of the campaign, the rain was lashing against the reinforced glass of the study windows. The rest of the house was entirely silent. I was hunched over a laptop, my eyes burning from the harsh blue light, tracing a series of wire transfers Julian had attempted to mask as charitable donations. I felt the heat of Victor's presence before I heard his footsteps. He walked into the room carrying 2 crystal glasses and a bottle of expensive, dark bourbon. He set a glass near my elbow, careful not to let his hand brush mine. He maintained that boundary with iron discipline. Since the wedding night, he had not touched me, not once. You've been staring at that screen for 7 hours. Clara, Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated pleasantly in my tired mind. The numbers are starting to bleed together. Take a breath. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, rubbing my temples. Julian is panicking. He's liquidating the real estate portfolio Arthur bought in the 90s. He is trying to generate enough cash to pay off his local muscle before they realize he can't afford them anymore. Victor poured a measure of bourbon into my glass. The amber liquid glowed under the warm desk lamp, and I took a sip, the heat blooming in my chest. I already rerouted the escrow accounts. When the buyers transfer the funds tomorrow morning, the money won't go to Julian's primary holding company. It will be absorbed by a phantom corporation we registered last Thursday. By noon tomorrow, Julian Sterling will be completely, irreversibly bankrupt. He won't have the capital to buy a cup of coffee, let alone fund a syndicate. Victor slowly lowered his own glass. He looked at me, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. It was a terrifying expression, but for the first time in my life, that terror wasn't directed at me. It was a weapon being wielded on my behalf. "You are a very dangerous woman, Clara," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the high silk collar of my blouse before returning to my eyes. "I had an excellent teacher," I replied quietly. "My father taught me exactly how monsters think. It just never occurred to him that I might use that education." Victor stepped around the desk. He leaned against the heavy wood, crossing his arms over his broad chest. The proximity was deliberate, testing the waters, offering closeness without demanding it. "How does it feel?" he asked softly. "Knowing you hold the match that burns it all down." I looked at the rain tracking down the glass. "It feels like I can finally breathe. For the first time in 32 years, I feel safe." The word hung in the air between us. Safe, it was a foreign concept. A fragile glass ornament I was terrified to hold too tightly. Victor's expression softened, the hard, violent lines of his jaw relaxing. He reached out, his knuckles hovering just a millimeter above the back of my hand, resting on the desk. He didn't close the distance, but the heat of his skin was an anchor. "You are safe here," Victor vowed, his voice a fierce, unyielding promise. "When Julian falls tomorrow, the Sterling name dies, and you will never have to look over your shoulder again." The next morning, the financial trap snapped shut with deafening silence. We stood in the war room, watching the digital monitors as Julian's accounts were drained, locked and legally frozen by a cascade of injunctions I had drafted. It was surgical. It was bloodless. It was absolute victory. We owned the city. We owned the ports. And for the first time in my existence, I felt the intoxicating rush of true autonomy. I belonged to myself, but in the world of monsters. Safety is the most dangerous illusion of all. 3 days later, the victory shattered. I was sitting in the conservatory, a room filled with lush greenery and warm, ambient sunlight, drinking tea and reading a novel. I was smiling. A genuine, unguarded smile. Victor was supposed to return from the docks within the hour to take me to dinner. My laptop chimed on the glass table, an encrypted alert from our banking monitors. I set my teacup down, an involuntary chill tracing its way up my spine. Julian's accounts, which had flatlined at zero, were suddenly flooding with capital. Not thousands, millions. Tens of millions of dollars were pouring into his shell companies from an untraceable offshore source. My heart hammered against my ribs. Julian didn't have this kind of money. He didn't have these kinds of connections. He was a coward who had been bled dry. Someone else was funding him. Someone with pockets deeper than the Sterling Empire had ever possessed. I opened the security feed for the estate's perimeter, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The screen flickered. A sharp camera pan showed the heavy wrought iron gates of the Thorne estate. Everything looked normal. The guards were at their posts, but in the shadows of the tree line, just beyond the reach of the security lights, a dark, blurred silhouette stood perfectly still, a man in a tactical vest, watching the house through the scope of a high-powered rifle. Julian wasn't a mastermind. He was a pawn. And Elias Vance, Victor's oldest and most ruthless cartel rival, had just stepped out of the shadows, buying Julian's debt and launching a war that was never supposed to happen. The illusion of safety dissolved like smoke in a hurricane. The FBI did not knock. They shattered the glass. And suddenly, The only man who had ever protected me was forced to his knees. It happened at 2:00 a.m. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, masking the sound of the armored vehicles breaching the front gates. I was awake, pacing the floor of the master's suite, waiting for Victor to return from an emergency meeting with his lieutenants after I had discovered the Vance funding. The first explosion shook the foundation of the house. It was a flashbang, deployed in the grand foyer. The concussive boom was followed instantly by the sound of tactical boots swarming the marble floors, accompanied by the blinding glare of assault rifle flashlights cutting through the darkness. Federal agents. "Get on the ground. Do not move." The screaming echoed up the sweeping staircase. Before I could process the panic, the heavy oak door of the master bedroom was kicked open, the wood splintering violently around the lock. Foremen in tactical gear swarmed in, weapons raised, laser sights painting erratic red dots across my chest. "Hands where we can see them." The lead agent roared. I raised my hands slowly. I did not scream. My father's training took over, locking my emotions into a cold, detached vault. I stepped back, my bare feet cold against the rug. A second later, Victor was dragged into the room by 3 other agents. His hands were zip-tied behind his back. His face was bruised, a thin trail of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth where he had clearly taken the butt of a rifle. He was not struggling, but his eyes were wide, frantic, searching the room until they locked onto me. "Clara," Victor ground out, fighting the grip of the agents forcing him downward. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "Shut up," an agent barked, driving a knee into the back of Victor's leg, forcing the great syndicate boss to his knees on the floor. I took a step forward, my voice cutting through the chaos with icy precision. "Take your hands off my husband. Do you have a warrant for this intrusion?" A man in a cheap, off-the-rack suit strolled into the bedroom, pushing past the tactical teams. He held up a piece of paper, a smug, venomous smile twisting his lips. "We have a warrant for the entire estate. Mrs. Thorne, signed by a federal judge. We have credible intel that Victor Thorne is harboring illegal narcotics and unregistered automatic weapons on this property." "That is a lie," I stated flatly. "Victor does not keep inventory at his private residence." "You are wasting your time." The agent smirked. "Then I guess you won't mind us looking." They tore the house apart. For 3 hours. I stood in the center of the bedroom, surrounded by armed guards, while they ripped the mattress open, smashed the drywall, and emptied the safes. They found exactly what Elias Vance had paid Julian to plant, hidden in the false bottom of a decorative antique trunk. A trunk Julian had insisted on sending over as a wedding gift to preserve the sterling facade. They pulled out 3 kilos of heroin and a cache of illegal firearms. Well, the agent said, holding up a plastic evidence bag. "Looks like we found the stash. Get him out of here." They hauled Victor to his feet. He didn't look at the agent. He looked at me. His obsidian eyes were burning with a desperate, silent message. "Stay safe. Trust no one." "Victor," I breathed, taking a half step forward before a rifle barrel blocked my chest. "I'll handle this," Victor said, his voice terrifyingly calm despite the blood on his teeth. "Do not leave the house. Clara, lock the doors." They dragged him away. The heavy front doors slammed shut. The flashing red and blue lights faded down the driveway, leaving me standing in the absolute ruins of my sanctuary. The silence that followed was suffocating. By sunrise, the reality of the situation crystallized. I was entirely alone. Victor's lieutenants were scattering, paranoid and leaderless. The bank accounts were temporarily frozen by the federal raid. Elias Vance was not just trying to arrest Victor. He was going to have him assassinated in federal holding. I had 48 hours before Victor Thorne was murdered in a cell. I walked into my shattered closet. I bypassed the comfortable, soft clothes Victor liked me to wear. I reached into the back and pulled out the armor of my past, a sharp, tailored, designer black suit, a silk blouse, and high heels. I pulled my hair back into a severe, unforgiving twist. I painted my lips a dark, bruising red. I looked in the mirror, summoning the ghost of the Sterling heiress. I drove myself to the city's most exclusive country club. It was the epicenter of high society, a place where my father had ruled, and where the elite gathered to drink champagne and ignore the blood on their money. The dining room went quiet when I walked in. I ignored the whispers. I walked straight to a corner table where Senator Hayes and Judge Mitchell were having lunch. They were men who had eaten at my father's table. Men who had looked the other way while Arthur Sterling brutalized his family. So long as their campaign contributions cleared, Clara, Senator Hayes said, his smile tight, his eyes darting nervously to the exits. This is a surprise. We heard about your unfortunate situation this morning. I didn't sit down. I placed hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth. Leaning in, I need Victor's bail expedited, Senator. The judge who signed the warrant is in Vance's pocket. I need you to make the calls to get a federal bond hearing scheduled for this afternoon. Judge Mitchell cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. Now, Clara, you have to understand. The optics of this are terrible. Victor Thorne isn't a criminal, and with the evidence they found, our hands are tied. We can't associate with this kind of scandal. Optics, I asked, my voice a venomous whisper. My father funded your re-election campaign with money soaked in blood. Marcus, you didn't mind the optics when you were cashing his checks. You owe the Sterling family. Senator Hayes scoffed, his polite dropping entirely. The Sterling family is dead. Clara, Julian is a joke. And you married a thug who is about to spend the rest of his short life in a federal penitentiary. You have no leverage. You have no money. You have nothing. He looked me up and down, his gaze filled with a dismissive, humiliating pity. You were always a pretty ornament, Clara, but an ornament is only valuable when it belongs to a powerful man. Right now, you belong to a dead man. Go home. Hide. Stop embarrassing yourself. I stood up straight. The humiliation burned hot in my chest, a physical fire that threatened to choke me. But beneath the humiliation, a profound, chilling clarity settled over my mind. They were right. The system would never protect me. The law was just a tool bought and paid for by the highest bidder. They only respected the men who owned me. They never respected me. Thank you, Senator, I said softly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. You have been incredibly illuminating. I turned on my heel and walked out of the country club. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. The victim they expected me to be died on that expensive carpet. I drove back to the Thorne estate. The remaining loyal guards were standing aimlessly in the foyer. I didn't ask for permission. I walked straight past them. Descending the stairs into the basement, I bypassed the ruined war room and approached the heavy steel vault door at the end of the corridor, Victor's private armory. I punched in the sequence of numbers Victor had casually mentioned 3 nights ago, testing to see if he truly trusted me. The heavy locks disengaged with a satisfying mechanical clunk. I pulled the massive door open. The room was lined with matte black weaponry, stacks of untraceable currency, and rows of encrypted servers. I didn't look at the guns. I walked to the servers. I sat down at the terminal, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I couldn't rely on the law. I couldn't rely on favors. If Elias Vance wanted to play a game of blackmail and destruction, he was about to learn that Arthur Sterling's daughter was the most ruthless architect of ruin in the city. I was going to find Elias Vance's head accountant. I was going to find the paper trail of the bribes he paid to the FBI. And I was going to tear the federal case apart with my bare hands. I did not bring a lawyer to the federal courthouse. I brought Elias Vance's head accountant and a very heavily redacted hard drive. Finding Silas Reed had not been difficult. Men who managed dirty money always left a digital footprint if you knew where to look. My father had taught me how to read financial ledgers the way other children learned to read fairy tales. Sitting in the cold, humming silence of Victor's underground armory, I had bypassed the weapons and focused entirely on the servers. It took me 4 hours to crack the routing numbers Julian had used. It took me another 2 hours to trace those numbers back to a shadow corporation owned by Elias Vance. And it took exactly 10 minutes to realize that Silas Reed, Vance's most trusted numbers man, had been quietly skimming millions off the top of the cartel's operational funds for the past 3 years. I did not call the police. I did not ask for a meeting. I simply found out where Silas Reed drank his scotch on a Wednesday night, and I went to him. The exclusive lounge was located in the basement of a high-rise downtown. It was dark, smelling of imported cigars and expensive leather. The lighting was low and amber, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. Silas Reed was sitting alone in a corner booth. He was a small, nervous man in a suit that cost more than a luxury car. I slid into the leather booth directly across from him. I did not ask for permission. Silas blinked, his hand freezing around his glass. He recognized me immediately. Anyone in the underworld knew the face of the sterling heiress, especially the woman who had just been married off to Victor Thorne. "Mrs. Thorne," Silas said, his voice trembling slightly before he forced a condescending smile. "I think you are in the wrong establishment. Your husband's territory ends 3 blocks west of here. Assuming your husband ever sees the outside of a federal cell again. That is," I placed a thick, manila envelope on the polished mahogany table. I slid it across the surface until it touched the base of his glass. "I am not here to discuss territory." "Silas," I said. My voice was perfectly modulated, calm, lethal. "I am here to discuss the Cayman account you opened under your sister-in-law's maiden name, the one currently holding $12 million of Elias Vance's money." The color drained from Silas Reed's face so fast he looked like a corpse. His condescending smile vanished. His eyes darted frantically toward the exit, looking for his security detail. "They are outside," I stated, leaning back against the leather booth. "But they work for Vance, don't they?" I wonder what they would do if I walked out there right now and handed them the second copy of this file. Cartels are not known for their generous severance packages. Silas stared at the envelope. A bead of cold sweat rolled down his temple, catching the dim amber light. "What do you want?" "Elias Vance paid the federal judge to sign that warrant against my husband," I said, my tone flat and unyielding. "He paid the tactical team to plant 3 kilos of heroin in my bedroom. I want the routing numbers for those bribes. I want the communication logs. I want irrefutable proof that the entire raid was a fabricated hit. And I want you to walk into the federal courthouse with me and hand it directly to the district attorney. If I do that, Vance will kill me," Silas choked out. "If you don't do it, I will make sure Vance finds out about your theft before midnight," I replied. "You can take your chances with the Federal Witness Protection Program, Silas. Or you can take your chances with a cartel boss who likes to use a blowtorch on thieves. Choose." He chose the feds. The federal courthouse was a monolithic structure of white marble and cold, glaring fluorescent lights. It was a place designed to make citizens feel small and powerless. I walked through the metal detectors with my spine perfectly straight, my designer heels clicking a sharp, steady rhythm against the polished stone. Silas Reed walked beside me, sweating through his expensive suit, clutching the hard drive like a life preserver. I bypassed the offices of Judge Mitchell and Senator Hayes. I did not need corrupt politicians anymore. I walked directly into the office of the chief federal prosecutor, a woman known for her absolute, unbending hatred of cartel corruption. I placed the evidence on her desk. I gave her the accountant, and I gave her the rope to hang the corrupt judge who had authorized the raid. Within 2 hours, the charges against Victor Thorne were dropped. I waited outside the federal holding facility. The sky had cracked open, unleashing a torrential downpour. The city's streets were slick and black, reflecting the harsh yellow glow of the street lamps. I stood under a large black umbrella, the freezing rain drumming a chaotic rhythm against the canopy. The heavy steel doors of the precinct opened. Victor walked out. He was not wearing handcuffs. His charcoal suit was ruined, wrinkled and stained with the dampness of a holding cell. The bruising on his jaw had darkened to a violent purple, but his posture was unbreakable. He moved with that same slow, terrifying grace. He stopped at the top of the concrete steps. The rain immediately soaked his dark hair. His obsidian eyes scanned the street. They bypassed the waiting armored SUVs. They bypassed his scrambling lieutenants. His gaze locked instantly onto me. The distance between us vanished. Victor descended the steps and walked straight into the shelter of my umbrella. The scent of rain, bergamot, and cold ozone washed over me. He looked down at me, his chest heaving slightly. The prosecutor told me Elias Vance's accountant walked in and confessed to everything. Victor said, his voice a low, rough rumble. She said my wife brought him in on a leash. He was embezzling, I replied smoothly, looking up into his dark eyes. I simply offered him a choice between federal prison and cartel justice. He made the logical decision. Victor stared at me. The ambient light caught the sharp angles of his bruised face. There was no patronizing amusement in his expression. There was only a profound, devastating respect. The kind of respect that shifts the very foundation of a relationship. I told you to lock the doors and hide. Clara, I am done hiding. Victor, I held his gaze without blinking. My father locked me in rooms for 20 years. I will not let another man put me in a cage, not even to protect me. Victor reached up. His large, calloused hand wrapped around the handle of the umbrella, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact sent a sharp, electric jolt up my arm. He did not take the umbrella from me. He simply shared the weight of it. You did not just protect me today, Victor murmured, the rain roaring around us, creating a private, isolated world beneath the black canopy. You waged a war for me. You stepped into the mud. We are married, I said softly. I protect what is mine. A dark, dangerous fire ignited in Victor's eyes. It was not the cold fire of a syndicate boss. It was the consuming, desperate fire of a man who had finally found his equal. Let's go home, he commanded gently. The ride back to the estate was silent, but the air inside the armored SUV hummed with a new, volatile energy. The dynamic had permanently shifted. I was no longer the fragile collateral damage he needed to guard. I was the architect of his freedom. When we walked through the shattered front doors of the estate, the loyal guards straightened up, their eyes wide with awe. They did not look at me with pity anymore. They looked at me with fear. It was an intoxicating validation. We bypassed the ruined foyer and walked straight upstairs to the master suite. The federal agents had destroyed the room, but the massive bed remained intact. Victor stripped off his ruined suit jacket, tossing it onto a broken chair. He rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, exposing the heavy, corded muscles of his forearms. I stood in the center of the room, my adrenaline finally beginning to crash. A slight tremor worked its way into my hands. I tried to hide it by smoothing down the lapels of my black suit. Victor saw it. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He did not ask. He simply reached out and took my trembling hands in his. His grip was warm, solid, and incredibly grounding. Breathe, Clara, he ordered softly. I am fine, I whispered, though my voice betrayed me with a slight waver. I know you are. Victor lifted my right hand. He pressed his lips to my knuckles. It was a gesture of absolute devotion, a king bowing to his queen. Respect is not a gift I am giving you, Clara. It is the standard you have commanded today. From me, from my men, from this entire city. He looked into my eyes, the slow burn tension between us finally catching fire. You are terrifying, and you are magnificent. I did not step back. I leaned into his space, letting the heat of his body chase away the lingering chill of the rain and the courthouse. For the first time, the touch of a man did not feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. Show me the rest of your ledgers, I challenged, a genuine smile curving my lips. Let's finish destroying my brother. We owned the city. We owned the ports. And for exactly 3 days, I owned my own life. The dissolution of the Sterling Empire was a masterpiece of legal violence. With the federal charges against Victor dismissed, and the evidence of Elias Vance's bribery exposed, the cartel rival was forced into hiding to avoid a federal indictment. Julian was left completely unprotected. I sat at the head of the massive boardroom table in a high-rise law firm. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline. The sun was shining. The room smelled of expensive coffee and fresh ink. Julian sat at the opposite end of the table. He looked like a ghost, His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame. His hand shook as he held a gold fountain pen. Two of Victor's most intimidating lieutenants stood silently by the door, ensuring Julian did not attempt to flee. Victor stood directly behind my chair. His presence was a heavy, comforting shield. He did not speak. He did not need to. This was my victory. Sign the documents. Julian, I said. My voice was calm, pleasant, and utterly devoid of mercy. I pushed the thick stack of legal papers across the polished wood. They were the final transfer deeds. Julian was relinquishing his remaining minority shares in the legitimate shipping fronts. More importantly, he was signing away his control over our late mother's charitable trust. It was a massive fund. Millions of dollars that my father had used as a tax haven, and that Julian had used to fund his lavish lifestyle. Now the trust belonged entirely to me. Julian stared at the papers. A bead of sweat rolled down his pale forehead. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate pleading. "Clara," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, I am your brother. If I sign this, I have absolutely nothing. The creditors will take my cars. They will take the penthouse. I will be on the street." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I looked at the man who had ignored my screams for 20 years. I looked at the man who had sold me to a crime syndicate to cover his gambling debts. "When you signed a marriage contract handing me over to Victor, did you pause to consider if I would be on the street?" I asked softly. "Did you pause to consider if I would survive the night?" Julian swallowed hard, unable to meet my eyes. He looked down at the table. "You used my scars as currency." "Julian," I continued, my words striking like precise, surgical cuts. "You weaponized our father's abuse to buy yourself a few more months of luxury. You are not my brother. You are a parasite. Sign the papers. Or Victor's men will escort you to the docks to discuss your outstanding debts in person." Julian snatched the pen. He signed his name violently across the bottom of the pages. He threw the pen down, stood up, and practically ran out of the boardroom. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him. The Sterling Empire was officially dead. I sat back in the leather chair. A profound, overwhelming wave of relief washed over me. The heavy, invisible chains I had dragged around since childhood simply shattered. I looked down at the documents. My name, my trust, my autonomy. Victor placed his hands gently on my shoulders. The warmth of his palms seeped through the silk of my blouse. He leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the crown of my head. "Congratulations, Mrs. Thorne," Victor murmured. "You are a conqueror." The next 2 days at the estate were idyllic. They were a beautiful, dangerous illusion. Victor and I fell into a comfortable, deeply intimate routine. The walls of the master suite became a sanctuary where the syndicate boss and the heiress ceased to exist. We were simply Victor and Clara. We talked late into the night, mapping out the future of the legitimate shipping routes. He valued my insight. He listened to my strategies. He looked at me with a consuming, protective devotion that healed the darkest corners of my mind. On the third afternoon, the illusion cracked. Victor had to leave the estate. The fallout from Elias Vance's disappearance had created a power vacuum at the southern ports. Rival factions were testing the boundaries, trying to claim territory we had just conquered. Victor needed to be on the ground to reassert his absolute authority. "I will be back before dinner," Victor promised, standing in the grand foyer. He wore a dark leather jacket, hiding the holster strapped to his chest. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was incredibly gentle. "The perimeter is on full lockdown. Mercer has 30 men stationed around the property. You are completely safe." "I know," I said, smiling up at him. "Take care of the ports. I have hundreds of pages of charity trust restructuring to read through anyway." He kissed my forehead, a lingering pressure, before turning and walking out the front doors. The heavy locks engaged with a solid, reassuring thud behind him. I spent the next 3 hours in the conservatory. It was a beautiful, glass-enclosed room filled with orchids and exotic ferns. The late afternoon sun painted the white marble floors with warm, golden light, It was peaceful. It was perfect. I was sitting on a plush velvet sofa, my laptop balanced on my knees, reading through the bylaws of the newly reclaimed trust. I was going to use the money to fund shelters for victims of domestic abuse. I was going to use my father's dirty money to build sanctuaries. The irony was deeply satisfying. The conservatory doors opened quietly. I did not look up immediately, assuming it was a maid. "Just leave the tea on the table, please," I said, my eyes scanning a complex legal clause. "The boss requested you stay hydrated, ma'am." The voice belonged to Mercer, the head of Victor's personal security detail. He was a massive, scarred man who had worked for Victor for 10 years. He walked over, setting a delicate porcelain teacup and saucer on the glass table next to my laptop. "Thank you, Mercer," I said, finally looking up. Mercer did not smile. He did not nod. He simply stared at me, his eyes blank and unreadable. He took a deliberate step back, crossing his arms over his chest. He positioned himself directly in front of the conservatory's only exit. A tiny primal alarm bell rang in the back of my mind. The posture was wrong. The protocol was wrong. Victor's guards were instructed to maintain distance and remain unseen unless called upon. They did not stand over me while I drank tea. I looked at the teacup. The liquid inside was a pale, chamomile yellow, but a thin, iridescent film swirled on the surface. I froze. The warm sunlight suddenly felt like ice. "Who paid you?" "Mercer," I asked. My voice was steady, but my heart began a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. Mercer didn't flinch. "I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Thorne." "Drink your tea. Julian is bankrupt," I stated, my mind racing, calculating the variables. "He doesn't have the capital to buy the head of Victor Thorne's security. Elias Vance is in hiding. So who wrote the check?" "Julian didn't need capital to buy me," Mercer replied coldly. "Julian just had to introduce me to the right people. Elias Vance might be hiding from the feds, but the cartels he works for aren't. They offered me my own territory, a promotion Victor would never give me." Mercer uncrossed his arms. He reached under his jacket, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. "You are going to drink the tea, Clara," Mercer ordered. The use of my first name was a blatant, terrifying violation of the rules Victor had established. "It's a heavy sedative. You will fall asleep. We will carry you out the service entrance. Nobody gets shot. Nobody screams." I looked at the gun. I looked at the single door, blocked by a man 3 times my size. The estate was locked down. The loyal guards were outside, completely unaware that the threat was standing inside the glass walls. The safety I had felt for 3 days evaporated. It was a cruel, devastating joke. I had locked myself in a fortress, only to realize I was trapped inside with the wolves. I slowly reached out. My hand trembled as my fingers wrapped around the delicate porcelain handle of the teacup. I lifted it from the saucer. Mercer relaxed slightly, a cruel smirk touching his lips. He thought I was broken. He thought I was the obedient, terrified sterling heiress, choosing the quiet poison over the violent bullet. I didn't bring the cup to my lips. With a sudden, violent motion, I hurled the scalding hot tea directly into Mercer's eyes. He roared in pain, his hands flying to his face. I didn't hesitate. I threw the porcelain cup at the glass wall, shattering it into 1,000 jagged pieces. I lunged for the broken shards on the marble floor, but I was too slow. Before my fingers could grasp a weapon, a heavy gloved hand clamped over my mouth from behind. A second pair of arms wrapped around my waist, lifting me effortlessly off the floor. Julian stepped out from the shadows of the tall ferns. He had been hiding in the conservatory the entire time. Julian's face was twisted in a pathetic, desperate sneer. He held a medical syringe in his hand. The needle glinted in the golden sunlight. "I told you, Clara," Julian hissed, plunging the needle brutally into the side of my neck. "You belong to me." The fire of the injection ripped through my veins. The world tilted violently. The warm sunlight fractured into dark, closing shadows. The last thing I heard was the sound of the teacup shards grinding under Julian's expensive shoes. Then absolute darkness consumed me. I woke up to the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a heavy steel door locking from the outside. It was not a gentle awakening, My consciousness clawed its way out of a thick, suffocating chemical fog, panic surging through my veins before my eyes even fluttered open. My mouth tasted like bitter metal and dust. The ambient air was freezing, carrying the sharp, sterile scent of bleach and stale linen. I tried to sit up, my survival instincts screaming at me to move, to run, to find Victor. I couldn't move. A sharp, terrifying resistance bit into my wrists. I pulled harder, my muscles straining against the restraints. The sound of thick leather groaning against steel bed frames echoed in the small space. I ripped my eyes open, fighting against the heavy, narcotic blur that threatened to drag me back under. The room was a perfectly square box of blinding, flickering fluorescent light. The walls were lined with seamless, off-white padding. There were no windows. There were no sharp corners. There was only the bolted metal bed I was currently strapped down to, a heavy security door with a small, reinforced glass viewing window, and a single, glaring camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. I was in a cage, but it was not the gilded cage of my childhood, nor the heavily guarded sanctuary of the Thorn estate. This was a black site, a hole in the world where people were sent to be erased. I stopped struggling. I let my head fall back against the thin, uncomfortable pillow. The leather straps securing my wrists and ankles were thick, institutional-grade restraints. Pulling against them would only tear my skin and exhaust my already depleted adrenaline. I needed my mind clear. I needed to understand the exact dimensions of the nightmare Julian had dropped me into. I closed my eyes and focused on the art of breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. It was a technique I had learned in the dark basement of the Sterling estate, a way to detach my mind from the agonizing reality of my physical body. I pushed the terror down, locking it away behind a mental vault door. An hour passed, or maybe a day. Time did not exist in the sterile white box. Finally, the heavy metallic clank of a deadbolt turning shattered the silence. The steel door swung outward. Julian walked into the room. He was no longer the sweating, pathetic coward who had signed away his empire in the law firm. He was wearing a pristine, custom-tailored navy suit. His blonde hair was impeccably styled. He looked down at me, a sickening, triumphant smile stretching across his face. He held a thick manila folder in his left hand. Behind him stood Elias Vance. The cartel boss was older, his face weathered and scarred, radiating an aura of absolute, unchecked violence. He didn't look at me with any specific interest. He looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he had just purchased at an auction. "Good morning, Clara," Julian said, stepping up to the side of the metal bed. "Or evening. It's hard to tell down here, isn't it?" I did not speak. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion, a blank porcelain mask. "You always were too smart for your own good," Julian continued, pacing slowly beside the bed. "Did you really think I would just walk away? Did you really think you could take my money, humiliate me in front of the syndicate, and live happily ever after with your thug of a husband? Where is Victor?" My voice was a raspy, dry whisper, scraping against my parched throat. Elias Vance let out a low, rumbling chuckle from the doorway. "Victor Thorne is currently bleeding to death on the asphalt of the Southern Interstate, or he's already dead in the wreckage of his armored convoy. It hardly matters now." The chemical fog in my brain parted, revealing a chasm of absolute, bottomless despair. Julian opened the manila folder. He pulled out a stack of crisp, white legal documents and held them over my face so I could read the bold, black lettering at the top. "Order of involuntary psychiatric commitment. Decree of absolute legal conservatorship. You spent so much time looking at the bank accounts, Clara," Julian sneered, trailing a finger over the freshly stamped seal of the state court. "You forgot that our father had other contingency plans, medical records, psychological evaluations detailing your extreme delusions, your violent outbursts, your history of severe, untreatable psychosis. They are forged," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the absolute devastation tearing through my chest. "Arthur fabricated them to threaten my mother, and now I am using them to protect you," Julian mocked. his eyes shining with a sadistic, narcissistic glee. A private judge signed the order an hour ago. You are legally incompetent. Clara, you have no assets. You have no rights. You do not exist as an independent entity in the eyes of the law. You are my ward, and I have decided that you require long-term, intensive residential care at this highly exclusive, entirely off-the-grid facility. The realization was a physical blow. It was a flawless, devastating checkmate. Julian hadn't just stolen my money back. He had stolen my humanity by declaring me legally insane. He immediately invalidated the transfer deeds I had forced him to sign. The Sterling Empire, the Charity Trust, everything I had fought to reclaim, it was all back in his hands. It was a coordinated strike, Mrs. Thorne, Vance said, stepping further into the room, his heavy boots echoing off the linoleum floor. While Julian's bought and paid for security chief was dragging you out of the conservatory, my mercenaries paid a visit to your husband's primary safe house, the one with all the cash and the weapons. We burned it to the foundation. And when Victor rushed back from the docks to save his precious little bride, my men ambushed his convoy on the bridge. 3 catastrophic hits, perfect timing, 3 catastrophes. The safe house destroyed, Victor bleeding out on a highway, and me strapped to a bed in a black site asylum, stripped of my human rights. I looked up at the stark white ceiling. The despair was a suffocating, crushing weight pressing down on my chest. I had fought so hard. I had walked through the fire. I had outsmarted the corrupt politicians. I had stood beside the most dangerous man in the city and claimed my crown. And in the span of a single afternoon, the illusion of safety had been violently shattered. You can't keep me here forever, I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I don't have to, Julian replied, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. I could smell the expensive cologne he wore, masking the stench of his cowardice. The doctors here are very well compensated. They have a specific pharmaceutical regimen designed for patients with your severe trauma. In a few months, your mind will be so heavily medicated, you won't even remember your own name. You will be exactly what you were always meant to be. Clara, a silent, obedient ghost. He patted my cheek condescendingly. I violently turned my head away from his touch. Julian laughed. He turned and walked toward the door. Enjoy your stay, little sister. I will send your regards to Victor if they manage to find enough of his body to put in a casket. The heavy steel door slammed shut. The deadbolt engaged with a sickening, final thud. I was alone. I lay trapped beneath the blinding, flickering fluorescent lights. The silence of the padded room rushed in, pressing against my eardrums. For the first time since I was a terrified child shivering in my father's basement, I closed my eyes, and I allowed a single, burning tear to slide down my cheek. I had lost. I was entirely powerless. The monsters had won. They thought the sedatives would break my mind. They forgot my mind had been broken, dismantled, and meticulously rebuilt 20 years ago. The first week in the black site facility was an agonizing blur of chemical suppression. The corrupt orderlies, large men with blank eyes and rough hands, came into my cell twice a day. They unstrapped my wrists just long enough to force me to swallow heavy, chalky pills that tasted like lithium and despair. If I resisted, they used a syringe. I quickly learned that resistance was a tactical error. To survive a cage, you must convince the warden that the bird has lost its desire to fly. Arthur Sterling had unknowingly trained me for this exact scenario. When I was a teenager, locked in my room for days as punishment for imagined slights, I had learned how to fragment my consciousness. I learned how to separate the physical sensation of suffering from the core of my identity. Julian and Elias Vance believed they were destroying me with isolation and narcotics. They didn't realize they had simply thrown me back into my natural habitat. By the 8th day, I initiated the protocol. When the orderly came in with the morning dosage, I did not thrash against the leather restraints. I went completely limp. I let my eyes glaze over, mimicking the vacant, hollow stare of a broken mind. When he placed the pills on my tongue and handed me a paper cup of water, I swallowed the water, but subtly pushed the pills deep into the pocket of my cheek with my tongue. I coughed slightly, letting a drop of water spill down my chin, playing the part of the heavily sedated. Compliant ward, the orderly sneered in disgust, wiping my chin roughly with a towel. He checked my mouth, but his inspection was careless. Born of arrogance, he strapped my right wrist back down, checked the buckles, and walked out. The moment the deadbolt clicked, I spat the dissolving, bitter pills into the collar of my hospital gown. I repeated this process for 4 agonizing days. The withdrawal from the heavy sedatives was a violent, physical hell. I suffered through severe tremors, cold sweats, and blinding migraines. I hid my shaking hands beneath the thin blanket. I bit the inside of my cheek until it bled to keep myself from screaming during the night terrors. But slowly, the chemical fog began to recede. My mind sharpened into a razor blade of pure, unadulterated focus. I began to study the room. I analyzed the patrol patterns. I learned that the heavy steel door was controlled by a magnetic keycard. I noticed that the night shift orderly, a man named Griggs, walked with a slight limp and always wore his keycard attached to a retractable lanyard on his left hip. I was not waiting for Victor Thorne to rescue me, if Victor was alive. He was fighting his own war against Vance's cartel. I was going to orchestrate my own salvation. I was going to reclaim my stolen autonomy with my bare hands. On the evening of the 12th day, the torrential rain returned, battering the unseen roof of the facility and masking any ambient noise. Griggs opened my door for the final check of the night. He did not bring restraints, because of my fabricated compliance. They had stopped strapping me to the bed at night, assuming I was too heavily medicated to even stand. Griggs stepped into the room, holding a flashlight and a clipboard. He looked at the bed. It was empty. I was pressed flat against the wall directly behind the door, hidden in the blind spot created by the heavy steel hinges. As Griggs stepped further into the room, confused, I moved. I did not have weapons. I had the element of surprise, and I had 20 years of repressed rage. I lunged forward, wrapping my forearm securely around the front of Griggs's throat, cutting off his windpipe instantly, before he could react. I drove my knee with devastating force into the back of his bad leg. Griggs buckled with a muffled grunt, collapsing to the linoleum floor. I went down with him, maintaining the chokehold, locking my legs around his torso. He thrashed wildly, his heavy elbows connecting with my ribs, driving the breath from my lungs. The pain was sharp and blinding, but it was nothing compared to the burn of a kettle or the strike of a leather crop. I tightened my grip, holding on with the desperate, feral strength of a survivor. Seconds stretched into eternity. Griggs's struggles grew weaker, his oxygen supply completely severed. Finally, his body went limp, plunging into unconsciousness. I rolled off him, gasping for air, clutching my bruised ribs. I did not waste a single second. I reached down and ripped the magnetic key card from his belt. I crept out of the cell and into the dimly lit, silent corridor. The escape was a terrifying game of shadows. I moved through the labyrinth of the facility like a ghost, avoiding the security cameras I had meticulously mapped in my mind. During the few times I was escorted to the interrogation room, I swiped the key card at the main security junction, holding my breath until the light flashed green. I pushed through the final fire exit. The biting, freezing air of the storm hit me like a physical blow. The facility was located in the middle of a dense, overgrown forest, miles away from civilization. The rain was absolute. A torrential sheet of black water that soaked through my thin cotton hospital gown. In seconds, I ran. I ran barefoot through the jagged underbrush, the sharp rocks and broken branches tearing the soles of my feet to shreds. Mud coated my legs. The freezing rain blinded me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The alarm klaxon suddenly erupted behind me. A wailing, mechanical scream that pierced the roar of the storm. They knew I was gone. Vance's mercenaries would be releasing the dogs. I scrambled up a steep, muddy embankment, my fingers digging desperately into the wet earth. My lungs burned. My bruised ribs screamed in agony. I reached the crest of the hill and collapsed onto a stretch of cracked, abandoned asphalt. It was an old logging road. I lay there in the freezing mud, utterly exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the agonizing reality of my broken body. I could hear the distant shouts of men and the barking of tracking hounds echoing up from the valley below. They were coming. I had fought so hard. I had broken the cage, but I had nowhere to go. Then, two blinding beams of light cut through the heavy curtain of rain. A massive, armored SUV tore around the bend of the logging road. It was a terrifying sight. The vehicle was heavily battered, the front grille smashed, the side panels riddled with high-caliber bullet holes. It screeched to a halt mere feet from where I lay in the mud. The heavy driver's side door kicked open. Victor Thorne stepped out into the storm. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and slaughtered the devil on his way out. His dark suit was ruined, soaked in rain and blood. His left arm was strapped tightly to his chest in a makeshift sling, the fabric heavily stained with dark crimson. He held a high-powered rifle in his right hand. He saw me lying on the asphalt. The rifle dropped from his hand, clattering against the wet road. Clara, his voice was a raw, desperate roar that shattered the storm. He closed the distance in a single second, falling to his knees in the freezing mud beside me. He didn't care about his bleeding shoulder. He wrapped his one good arm around me, pulling my soaked, freezing, trembling body fiercely against his chest. "I'm here," Victor choked out, burying his face in my wet hair, his massive frame shaking with an overwhelming, terrifying relief. "I'm here, my God. You're alive." "I'm here." I clung to the lapels of his ruined jacket. The scent of rain, gunpowder, and blood was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. I buried my face in his neck, the heat of his skin instantly chasing away the freezing chill of the forest. "You're bleeding," I whispered, my voice breaking as my fingers brushed the edge of his makeshift sling. "It's nothing," Victor said firmly, pulling back just enough to frame my face with his rough, calloused hand. His dark eyes scanned my muddy, bruised face, taking in the ripped hospital gown and my bleeding feet. His expression hardened into a look of absolute, lethal fury, directed entirely at the men who had put me here. He didn't treat me like a fragile victim. He looked at me with profound reverence. "I tore the city apart looking for you," Victor said, his thumb gently wiping a streak of mud from my cheek. "I burned Vance's remaining territories to ash until one of his lieutenants finally gave up these coordinates. But you didn't wait for me. I told you." "Victor," I breathed, a fierce, exhausted smile touching my lips. "I am done hiding." Victor let out a sound that was half law, half sub. He carefully lifted me into his arms, protecting my bruised ribs, and carried me to the idling, bullet-riddled SUV. He set me gently into the passenger seat, wrapping a heavy wool blanket around my shivering shoulders. He climbed into the driver's seat, ignoring the agony in his wounded shoulder, and threw the heavy vehicle into gear as we sped away down the dark mountain road, leaving the black site facility and Vance's mercenaries far behind us. Victor reached over and took my bruised, muddy hand in his. He kissed my knuckles, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "You freed yourself, Clara. Now, it is time we teach Julian and Elias Vance exactly what happens when you try to bury a queen." Julian was drinking my father's scotch in from my father's house when the front door caved in. The storm had finally broken, leaving the night air freezing and completely still. A heavy, suffocating fog rolled off the Atlantic, blanketing the manicured lawns of the Sterling estate. For 20 years, this sprawling Tudor mansion had been my prison. Its towering stone walls and iron-wrought gates were designed to keep the world out, and to keep my screams locked inside. Tonight, those defenses meant absolutely nothing. Victor Thorne did not approach the estate with stealth. He approached it with the overwhelming, devastating force of a king reclaiming his stolen territory. I sat in the passenger seat of the armored SUV, watching the dark silhouette of my childhood home loom through the fog. My hands rested in my lap. They were perfectly steady. I was wearing a borrowed black trench coat over my ruined hospital gown, the thick wool providing a necessary layer of armor against the biting cold. My bare, bandaged feet were shoved into a pair of tactical boots Victor had found in the vehicle. My ribs ached with every breath, and my throat was still bruised from the fight in the asylum. But my mind was a terrifying, crystal clear weapon. Victor sat beside me behind the steering wheel. A combat medic had stabilized his shoulder in the back of the SUV, binding the bullet wound tightly with gauze and adrenaline. He refused pain medication. He refused to rest. His dark hair was slicked back, his jaw set in a rigid, unforgiving line. He looked at the sterling gates, his obsidian eyes burning with a cold, calculated fury. He lifted a heavy, encrypted radio to his mouth. Execute. The breach was instantaneous and entirely deafening. 4 modified transport trucks slammed into the perimeter simultaneously. The heavy iron gates of the Sterling estate shrieked, buckling under the immense kinetic force before crashing violently onto the cobblestone driveway. Victor's loyal lieutenants, the men who had refused to scatter when the federal raid hit, poured into the courtyard. Elias Vance had stationed 24 heavily armed cartel mercenaries around the property to protect Julian. They were seasoned killers, but they were fighting for a paycheck. Victor's men were fighting for their lives, their territory, and a boss who commanded absolute, unbreakable loyalty. The courtyard erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire. The sharp, rapid cracks of assault rifles echoed against the stone facade of the mansion. Muzzle flashes illuminated the heavy fog, casting long, erratic shadows across the manicured hedges. It was a brutal, efficient extermination. Victor did not flinch at the sound of the violence. He shifted the SUV into gear and drove straight through the shattered gates, the heavy tires crunching over the twisted iron. He parked directly at the base of the grand marble steps leading to the front doors. He turned off the engine. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He looked at me, the harsh shadows of the night carving his face into a mask of pure lethality. "Stay behind me," Victor commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the noise of the gunfire outside. "I will clear the path. You deliver the execution." I nodded once. We stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the marble stairs. The massive double oak doors of the mansion were locked. Victor didn't bother with the handle. He raised a heavy tactical shotgun with his good arm and fired a single, devastating slug directly into the brass locking mechanism. The wood splintered violently. He kicked the doors open. The grand foyer was exactly as I remembered it, the sweeping mahogany staircase, the imported crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling, the pristine Persian rugs that had absorbed so much of my blood over the years. 3 of Vance's guards were waiting at the top of the stairs. They raised their weapons. Victor moved faster than my eyes could track, despite his injured shoulder. His lethal precision remained entirely intact. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. The deafening roar of the shotgun echoed through the cavernous foyer. The guards collapsed, their bodies tumbling down the carpeted stairs and landing in a heap on the marble floor. Silence descended on the interior of the house. The remaining cartel mercenaries were either dead in the courtyard or fleeing into the fog. "The master study," I whispered, stepping over the fallen guards. "It is down the west hall. That is where Arthur always conducted his business. That is where Julian will be." We walked down the long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with oil portraits of my ancestors. Stern, wealthy men who had built their fortunes on the backs of the desperate and the broken. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the heavy oak door at the very end of the hall. Victor reached the door first. He did not kick this one open. He simply turned the brass knob and pushed it wide. The master study was warm, smelling of cedarwood and expensive tobacco. A fire roared in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing orange light across the room. Julian Sterling sat behind my father's massive desk. He looked small. He looked pathetic. He was clutching a heavy crystal tumbler of scotch, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with absolute, consuming terror. He looked at Victor's blood-soaked suit. He looked at the heavy weapon in Victor's hand. Then his gaze shifted to me. "Clara," Julian gasped, his voice a high, reedy sound that betrayed his cowardice. He dropped the tumbler. The glass shattered against the edge of the desk, spilling expensive amber liquid over the polished wood. How did you? The asylum was impenetrable. Vance guaranteed it. I walked into the room. I did not hide behind Victor. I stepped around him, moving into the center of the study, standing directly in the glow of the fireplace. Nothing is impenetrable, Julian, I said smoothly. My voice did not shake. It carried the absolute authority of a woman who had survived the worst the world had to offer. You locked a battered, broken girl in a cage with monsters. You just forgot to consider that the girl might learn how to speak the monster's language. Julian scrambled backward in his leather chair, pressing himself against the wall. Victor, listen to me. Vance forced my hand. He threatened my life. I had to sign those papers. I had to put Clara away. It was the only way to survive. Victor did not speak. He leaned against the doorframe, keeping his weapon lowered but ready. He was merely a witness to this trial. This was my courtroom. I reached inside the pocket of the heavy trench coat. I pulled out a thick, manila folder. I walked over to the desk and tossed the folder onto the leather blotter. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. Do you know what is in that folder, Julian? I asked, resting my hands on the back of a guest chair. Julian stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive. He shook his head slowly. It is a comprehensive digital footprint, I explained, enunciating every word with icy precision. It contains the routing numbers you used to transfer Vance's money. It contains the forged medical documents you submitted to the private judge. But more importantly, it contains the unedited, original security footage from the conservatory of the Thorne estate. The footage of you holding a syringe, injecting a lethal sedative into my neck while I fought for my life. Julian's face turned the color of ash. You can't have that. Vance's men scrubbed the servers. I am Arthur Sterling's daughter, I replied softly. I always keep a secondary, off-site backup of the ledgers. You should have remembered that before you decided to play a game of espionage. I took a slow, deliberate step around the side of the desk, closing the distance between us. Julian shrank away from me, his breathing shallow and rapid. I sent that folder to the chief federal prosecutor an hour ago, I said. I also sent it to the major news outlets. And just to ensure absolute transparency, I had Victor's men deliver a hard copy to the leadership of Elias Vance's rival cartels, the ones Vance stole territory from to fund this little war of yours. Julian let out a strangled, pathetic sob. He slipped out of the chair, falling to his knees on the Persian rug. He clasped his hands together in a desperate gesture of supplication. Clara, please. Julian begged, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat on his cheeks. They will kill me. The feds will lock me away forever. And if they don't, the cartels will flay me alive. I am your brother. We have the same blood. You have to stop them. You have to tell Victor to protect me. I looked down at him. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger. Just a profound, hollow emptiness where my familial love was supposed to be. You watched our father whip the skin from my back, I whispered, the memories flashing behind my eyes like a terrible, silent film. You turned up the music in your bedroom so you wouldn't have to hear me scream. When I begged you to help me, you looked the other way. You sold me to a crime syndicate to cover your gambling debts. And you tried to lock me in an asylum to rot in a chemical coma. I leaned down so my face was inches from his. Silence in the face of abuse is not neutrality. Julian, it is participation. And your silence ends tonight. I turned my back on him. I walked away from the desk, crossing the room to stand beside Victor. What are you doing? Julian screamed, his voice cracking in absolute panic. You can't just leave me here. They are coming for me. Clara. The federal authorities will arrive in approximately 10 minutes, I stated, looking at him over my shoulder. If you are lucky. They will arrest you before the cartel hit squads figure out the security gates are down. I suggest you start running. I looked at Victor. He offered me his good arm. I took it, wrapping my fingers around the warm, solid muscle of his forearm. We walked out of the master's study. We left the heavy oak door wide open. We did not look back as Julian's desperate, hysterical sobbing echoed down the long hallway, bouncing off the portraits of the dead Sterling patriarchs. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered, and the sentence was absolute ruin. I stood on the porch of the Sterling estate, a can of gasoline in one hand, and my husband's lighter in the other. It was 3 days after the raid. The dust had settled over the city, leaving a drastically altered landscape in its wake. Elias Vance was dead. His own cartel lieutenants had executed him the moment they realized he had compromised their operations and brought the full weight of the federal government down on their heads. The balance of power in the underworld had shifted permanently, leaving Victor Thorne as the undisputed, untouchable architect of the city's shadow economy. Julian did not escape the estate that night. The federal tactical teams arrived exactly 10 minutes after we left. They found him cowering in a closet in the master suite, clutching an empty bottle of scotch. He was denied bail. He was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding cell, facing a mountain of extortion, kidnapping, and conspiracy charges that would ensure he never saw the outside of a concrete wall again. The Sterling Empire was entirely dissolved. I had spent the last 48 hours with an army of lawyers, executing a brutal, systematic liquidation of my family's remaining legitimate assets. I sold the shipping fronts. I sold the real estate portfolios. I channeled every single dollar, including the massive reserves of my mother's reclaimed charity trust, into a newly established foundation. It was a foundation strictly dedicated to providing legal resources, safe housing, and psychiatric care for survivors of domestic violence and institutional abuse. I took the blood money my father had hoarded, and I weaponized it for healing. But there was one piece of the legacy left to handle. The night was bitter cold. The sky above was a pitch-black canvas, devoid of stars. The heavy stone facade of the Sterling mansion loomed behind me, silent and oppressive. I had dismissed the remaining staff. I had ordered the security cameras disabled. The property was completely isolated. Victor stood at the bottom of the porch steps. He had removed his sling earlier that afternoon, though his movements were still stiff and guarded. He wore a heavy black overcoat against the winter chill. He watched me with a quiet, intense focus. He did not try to take the heavy red canister of gasoline from my hand. He did not offer to do the labor for me. He understood that this was a threshold I had to cross on my own. I uncapped the canister. I started in the grand foyer. I poured the harsh, noxious chemical over the pristine Persian rugs. I walked into the formal dining room, soaking the velvet drapes in the mahogany table where my father had negotiated my life away. I moved methodically through the first floor, my boots leaving wet, toxic footprints on the marble tiles. Finally, I walked down the long west hallway and entered the master's study. The room was exactly as Julian had left it. The shattered crystal tumbler still lay on the floor. The heavy desk sat in the center of the room, a monument to tyranny. I lifted the canister and poured the remaining gasoline directly over the leather blotter, letting it soak into the wood, drenching the heavy leather chair. The fumes were overpowering, burning my eyes and making my lungs ache. It was the scent of destruction. It was the scent of freedom. I dropped the empty canister onto the rug. I turned around and walked out of the house. Victor was waiting for me at the edge of the driveway, standing a safe distance away from the sprawling structure. I walked down the marble steps, stopping beside him. I looked at the heavy, matte black Zippo lighter in my hand. The metal was cold. "Arthur Sterling built this house to last a century," I murmured, my voice a quiet breath in the freezing night air. "Arthur Sterling was an arrogant fool," Victor replied softly, stepping closer so our shoulders brushed. "Stone and wood can always burn. Clara, nothing they built is permanent." He reached into the interior pocket of his heavy overcoat. He pulled out a folded piece of thick, watermarked legal paper. He held it out to me. I looked at the document, confused. I didn't take it immediately. "What is this?" "It is an annulment decree," Victor said. His voice was completely steady, but I could see the rigid tension in his jaw. "I had my lawyers draft it this morning. It is already signed by a judge. It states that our marriage was entered into under extreme duress and coercion by third parties. It legally dissolves the contract. My breath hitched. The cold air suddenly felt like it was piercing my lungs. I stared at the paper in his hand. You have spent your entire life being owned, Clara Victor continued, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an absolute, agonizing sincerity. You were traded by your father. You were sold by your brother. And you were forced into a cage by me. We fought a war together, and you saved my life. But I will not build a future on a foundation of coercion. He pushed the paper closer to me. Take it, Victor commanded gently. Sign the bottom line. The trust is yours. The money is yours. You are completely independent. You can walk away from this city, away from the syndicate, away from me. And you will never have to look over your shoulder again. You have absolute freedom of choice. I looked at the great, terrifying syndicate boss. I looked at the man who had seen the ruined, scarred map of my back on our wedding night and chose to protect me instead of break me. I looked at the man who had bled for me, who had torn a city apart to find me, and who was now offering me the one thing I had been denied my entire existence: a choice. I reached out. My fingers brushed against the crisp edge of the legal document. I took it from his hand. Victor's chest ceased moving. He stopped breathing entirely, waiting for my decision. I looked down at the paper. Then I closed my hands. Gripping the top edge of the document, I pulled my hands apart, tearing the thick paper straight down the middle. The sound of the rip was sharp and loud in the quiet night. I placed the torn halves together and ripped them again, reducing the annulment decree to worthless shreds of paper. I opened my hands and let the winter wind catch the pieces, scattering them into the dark grass. I am Arthur Sterling's daughter, I said softly, looking up into Victor's stunned, obsidian eyes. I do not run from empires. I rule them. I took a step closer, eliminating the space between us. I reached up and rested my hand against his cheek, feeling the rough stubble along his jawline. He leaned into my touch instantly, closing his eyes, shuddering breath escaping his lips. You didn't put me in a cage. Victor, I whispered, you handed me the keys. I choose you. I choose this life, entirely of my own free will. Victor opened his eyes. The terrifying, consuming devotion I saw there stole the breath from my lungs. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me flush against his solid frame, and brought his mouth down on mine. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming, an offering, a profound sealing of a bond forged in fire and blood. I kissed him back with equal desperation, my hands tangling in his dark hair. There was no hesitation, no fear, no lingering ghosts of my past. I was entirely present, anchored to the earth by the weight and heat of my husband. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. Victor rested his forehead against mine. Burn it down, Mrs. Thorne, he whispered fiercely. I smiled. I turned around to face the dark, looming silhouette of the Sterling mansion. I flipped the lid of the Zippo open. Flint sparked. Catching the wick, a small, perfect yellow flame bloomed, dancing wildly in the freezing wind. I drew my arm back, and I threw the lighter directly through the shattered front doors of the grand foyer. The ignition was instantaneous. A heavy concussive whoosh sucked the oxygen from the porch. A massive wall of blue and orange fire erupted inside the house, racing violently across the gasoline-soaked rugs. The flames devoured the mahogany staircase, shattering the crystal chandelier in a shower of sparks. The heat slammed into my face, driving the winter chill away entirely. Victor wrapped his good arm around my waist, pulling my back flush against his chest. He stood like a solid, immovable shield behind me. We watched the gilded cage burn. The flames chewed through the heavy timber roof, sending a massive pillar of black smoke into the starless night sky. It cracked the upper windows, showering the lawn with broken glass. By morning, there would be nothing left of the Sterling legacy but a stone foundation and a mountain of gray ash. I leaned back against my husband. I felt the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beating against my spine. I was a woman who had been sold for revenge, heavily scarred and utterly broken. But as I stood in the absolute, blinding light of the fire, surrounded by the ruins of my past. I knew the truth. I was no longer collateral damage. I was Clara Thorne. And I was finally free. And so the gilded cage burns to the ground, leaving nothing but ash in the freezing winter wind. The story of Clara and Victor is far more than a thrilling tale of underworld syndicates and high-stakes revenge. It is a profound journey of survival, reclamation, and the agonizingly beautiful process of taking back one's own power. Clara Sterling was introduced to us as a pawn, a woman stripped of her voice, her agency, and her basic human rights by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Her scars were physical manifestations of a deeply rooted, systemic abuse, hidden beneath the pristine, suffocating veneer of high society. But as the flames consumed her childhood home, we witnessed the ultimate metamorphosis. She did not merely survive the monsters in her life, she learned to outmaneuver them, proving that the deepest traumas do not have to dictate our final chapters. She reminds us that true victims can evolve into absolute conquerors when they finally realize their own worth. Victor Thorne, despite his terrifying reputation in the criminal underworld, serves as a crucial narrative mirror to the cowardly men of Clara's past. He demonstrates that true masculine strength is not found in domination, intimidation, or control, but in the unwavering respect for another person's autonomy and dignity. When he discovered Clara's hidden pain on their wedding night, his immediate instinct was not to exploit her vulnerability, but to build an impenetrable fortress around it. Yet he did not lock her inside. He gave her the ledgers, he handed her the weapons, and he stepped back so she could fight her own battles. Most importantly, he offered her the ultimate gift that her family had always violently denied her, the absolute freedom of choice. Their romance challenges the traditional, toxic tropes often found in dark stories. It shows us that real, healing love does not demand submission, rather it thrives on equal ground, accountability, and the mutual desire to see each other stand tall. Through the tragic, pathetic downfall of Julian Sterling and the corrupt elite, this story delivers a stark, uncompromising lesson about complicity. Julian's cowardice reminds us that silence in the face of abuse is never neutrality, it is active, unforgivable participation. The narrative strips away the glamour of wealth to expose the rot of moral bankruptcy, urging us to question the societal systems that protect abusers while demanding silence from the victims. Clara's refusal to grant Julian mercy at the end is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary enforcement of boundaries and justice. It teaches us a difficult but vital lesson. Forgiveness is not an obligation, especially when dealing with those who willingly sacrificed our physical and mental well-being for their own comfort. Ultimately, Clara and Victor's journey is a testament to the fierce resilience of the human spirit. It is a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever felt trapped, silenced, gaslit, or treated as collateral damage in someone else's war. Your scars are not your identity, nor are they a sign of weakness. They are the undeniable receipts of a war you have already won. You have the fundamental right to claim your space, to demand absolute respect, and to burn down any structure, whether physical, emotional, or psychological, that attempts to keep you in a cage. You are not broken beyond repair. You are simply forging yourself into something unbreakable. This content was researched, developed, and manually edited by us to provide deep meaning and valuable lessons.